So my subject today is grief and loss as a detachment process in recovery. And then we're going to look at a process of how a person can deal with that. And grief is the experience of loss, and mourning is the expression of it. And so I not only need to experience, I need to mourn it. And that's more difficult. Our culture is not very good at supporting us in terms of experiencing the loss and getting it out and healing it. And we'll talk about some myths that impair that. And we'll talk about the process of grieving a relationship that's been significant to us. And every addict relationship is significant to them. Because when you look at what they pay to maintain it, it must be important. You see what I'm saying? It doesn't look like it. Most people understand that. But once you do, it's important. And it's also a two-part component. First thing is, I want to distinguish between cutting off and detachment. Cutting off is, you're right, just to stop the addictive behavior. And detachment, once I stop it, then I need to grieve the loss of that relationship. I need to unhook emotionally from it. And that's a little trickier, and that involves a grieving process. And so I'm going to use some of Kubler-Ross's stages, but I've redefined them around addictive loss to make them, I think, more significant. And then I'm going to ask you to start to do some of your own work around this. And use some music, hopefully, to help you get to that. And I've always found that healthy in terms of grieving, is certain songs and music can help me get in touch with that part of me that's been wounded. And that I was telling Perry, it's like having a hole in your soul. And for a lot of addicts, that's been around long as they have. And you try to fill it in with whatever you can. The addiction is sometimes a way of filling it in, or dysfunctional relationships, or well, we'll get to all that. I don't want to get too far ahead. I want to say a couple other things. When it comes to grieving, there's no right way to do it. It's a very personal process. Everybody kind of does it their own way. And there's no right way to do it. And these steps I'm going to go through are actually pretty irrelevant, because there might not be any such thing for some people. And you don't process through 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I'm all better. You can get hung up in any one of them, and you may skip around and start with this one and and then come back to another one. And the other thing is, grief is cumulative. It don't go away. And so when you've had a lot of losses or grief experiences in your life, and you have another one, it's not just that one, it's all these start to come up if you haven't resolved them. And some of them you never resolve. And so that's important to understand and be open to it. There's a part of you, and that's our God piece, that knows how to help us do that. The problem is, getting in touch with that sounds easier than it is. And you won't find it up here either, by the way, okay? That's an inside job. So I'm going to do a musical thing to try to help you internalize that focus into that part of you, and trust that process and what comes, and whatever you have to do to take care of it. Like I say, there's no right or wrong, and everybody's different. I'll start a little bit with me. I grew up in a family with my mom, who was never able to grieve the death of her mother when she was about 12, and my grandfather's alcoholism. So she lost both her mom and dad, basically one tangible, one less tangible, when she was a little girl, and had to be the mommy when she needed a mommy, and never really was able to look at that and deal with it, and got hung up in one of the stages. And And that got passed on when I was little. I think I picked up on a lot of that. I knew she was really sad, but I didn't know why. And when a kid experiences something wrong with their parents, who do they blame generally? Exactly. So my attitude was, my mommy is really sad, and the reason she's so sad is because of me. And you can build a good addictive behavior off something like that and all kinds of problems. And I did. And as I got older, I had to understand that. And then some of the losses that occurred around that, they don't go away until you deal with them. And so you have to, and sometimes they come back. Somewhere along the way, I lost my arm and leg on my left side. I was in a serious accident and should be dead. And I always say the only reason I'm still here is because God's got enough trouble up there, kind of thing. But I don't know. He knew more than I did about it. And I've done a lot of work to heal that, but periodically it gets triggered, it comes back, and I have to re-grieve it. I have to go back into that dark place and experience it. And every time you go back and experience it and face it and grieve it, you heal it a little bit. And that's the good news. The bad news is you don't ever get to all of it, I don't think. But you can, or as I would say, it ain't about how we get rid of it, it's about how we live with it. And I use the example of a Wisconsin winter. And if I have what I need to manage it and what I need to deal with it, it doesn't have to mess me up. But this isn't nearly that tangible. Au contraire, it's very, very intangible, and you can almost, and we're really good at avoiding it too. And when you avoid something, you actually give it more power and make it worse. So the trick is to learn how to face it and deal with it, get it out and talk about it, or make friends with it, whatever you have to do. Like I say, it's different for each person. Or as my dad told me when I bought my first house a lot of years ago, he said, well, son, now that you own a home, you never have to worry about having something to do. And that's true about these kind of things in our lives. When you have significant wounding or losses, you never have to worry about having something to do, because it's going to be there. You don't want to live in it, but you want to be able to know what to do with it when it comes up. And there are triggers all around us sometimes. And so that's, and knowing what the triggers are can help you anticipate it. For an addict, most addicts have a primary, and pardon the misspelling there, enmeshed relationship with their addiction. Primary means number one. That's the main relationship in their life. That relationship is more important than their family, their job, their health, or anything else in their world. And, and even if they know it's killing them, they still hang on to it. This codependent relationship becomes their primary focus, and is one of the most important parts of their life. Codependent is a word that comes out of family work and addictions. It means I'm dependent on the thing. And most of us are codependent coming out of our families. We learn that real young. We learn that out here is more important than here. And my value and worth don't come from who I am and what I can do for me. It comes from what's wrong with you and what I can do to try to fix that. And so addicts tend to be externalized, and that codependency is an addiction, I think, in and of itself. It meets the criteria. It would come under a process addiction. And I've heard that called the disease of the disease. I think most addicts start with codependency, and the other addictions come out of that, or manifestations of that. And giving up this addiction for an addict is, here again, it's like losing their best friend. It's a primary relationship. And how are you going to feel if you lose a best friend? It's going to hurt. I've had in the past couple weeks, I had a good friend of mine drive his car under a truck and kill himself. And I had another friend of mine call and tell me about another long-term friend of mine whose obit was in the paper this week, but I was out of town and didn't see it. So, and I thought, oh man, and it does hurt. So that old song, "There's always something there to remind me," comes to mind. So everything around you is a trigger. And I remember when so-and-so would do this and that kind of stuff. And that takes you right back into it. And often time can heal that. And just talking about it and mourning it can heal it. Often, though, there's always going to be some sadness and wounding around that. And you need to respect and honor it and be willing to do what you have to do to deal with it. Detachment versus cutting off. Let's look. Cutting off means to remove oneself physically from an addictive relationship. Okay. For the addict, this may mean abstaining from the addictive substance behavior. For the family, it may mean physically leaving, separating, or divorcing. And I think a lot of times we think that cutting off is recovery. Once I do that, I'm all better. Good examples of divorce. Here again, there's a lot of losses within the loss with divorce. I read somewhere one time it said, a divorce sometimes can be worse than the person dying, because, when it's a divorce, instead of burying the person, they bring his casket back and put it in the living room every weekend. And that makes it more difficult to finish and deal with. Detachment means to unhook emotionally from an addictive relationship. This is complicated by enmeshment, which is over-attachment. Because the more I'm attached to a relationship, harder it's going to be for me to unhook from it emotionally. Because the more significant it is, the more it hurts. And here again, it is a grieving process that involves the death of a primary relationship. And if you're a family member, that's been important. Loss of their addict identity, friend's lifestyle, that's more of an intangible component. The loss of the addictive behavior is more tangible. And the intangible losses can be just as significant as the tangible. Okay. For the family, it's the loss of their caretaker identity. Because a big part of my value and worth wasn't for what I could do for me, it was for what I could do for you. And so when I give up that identity, I don't have any reason to be. I don't have any sense of value and worth for me. And it's real easy to start transferring that over to other things and continue that. So you need to grieve those identities. And the stages of detachment parallel stages of grieving. Okay, our initial experience when there's a significant loss, whether it's a death or an accident or any kind of trauma, and significant loss is very traumatic, is to experience fear and terror. All of a sudden, things have changed, and I don't know how to belong in that new reality right away. And I've got this big hole and gap and this big part of me that's not there anymore, and it can be terrifying. It's almost like a PTSD reaction sometimes. And so the way I deal with it is I just deny it and I avoid it. This ain't happening. This ain't real. When I came out of a coma in the hospital, paralyzed, the first thing I thought was, this is a bunch of crap. This ain't happening. And I remember thinking, I'm going to roll over and take a nap, and when I wake up, it'll be all gone and I'll be all better again. And I rolled over and took a nap and woke up. I'm still there. And so, anger and blaming. And then the next thing I feel is resentment. This ain't fair. And in my experience, first person I blamed was myself, and then I blamed God. Because I grew up Southern Baptist, and I got the idea that God was going to get you. And I remember thinking, they always told me God was going to get me, and they're right about that so-and-so. I've come to learn that he was trying to get my attention. I don't know if you ever heard the story about the farmer's mule or not. And I'm going to tell it because I like it, all right? There was this farmer and he had a mule, and he's always bragging on the mule. This is the finest mule in the county, hardest working mule. It's the best mule you ever see in your life. And finally one day some guy said, would you shut up? I want to see the mule. Farmer said, no problem. He got in the truck and drove out to farm. Farmer says, he's right out here in the field. On the way through the barn, farmer picks up a 2x4. And he walks out and says, there he is. And the guy said, he don't look that great to me. Farmer said, watch this. And he walked up and he took that 2x4, came back, wham, hit that mule right between the eyes. The guy said, what'd you do that for? Farmer said, it's a damn good mule, but you got to get his attention first. And I think that was God trying to get my attention. He wore out an old growth forest on me, I'll tell you, because I'm a real slow learner. So then I feel a lot of anger and resentment. Then I start thinking, well, maybe I can do something. I start trying to cut a deal. Well, God, if you make this go away, I'll be good. I'll go to church every Sunday. I'll behave. I'll do everything you expect me to do if you'll just take this away. Or whoever. If you'll just do this, I'll do whatever you want me to do. You start trying to bargain, and it's manipulation. And that doesn't work either. The basic emotions here, the first one is fear and terror. The second one is resentment. This one is frustration. Because, I've tried to avoid it and that didn't work. Tried getting mad about it and that didn't work. So when in doubt, cut a deal. Right. So then I start trying to make deals and manipulate to make it better. And the final piece, Kubler-Ross caused depression. I don't think it is. I think depression is, I think grief complicated grief especially, looks a lot like depression. And we'll get to some of that. But it's important to distinguish it, because if it's not depression, then medicating is probably not a good idea. And the basic emotion here is anxiety. That's just another word for fear. But fear says, I'm afraid and I know why. Anxiety says, I'm afraid and I don't know why. It's the fear of the unknown. And I think a lot of times people in a grieving situation get misdiagnosed with anxiety when they're just, especially addicts. Addicts, when I work with addicts and they come in and they have an anxiety diagnosis, I explain the fear thing, and I'd say, given what's going on in your life, I'd be worried about you if you weren't anxious. So what we need to do is help you figure out how you're going to face this stuff so you don't have to be so afraid of it, and get it out in the open so you know what it is. Same with depression. The most common diagnosis of addicts coming into treat mental health diagnosis is depression. And I think a lot of times that's just a reaction to the losses they've had in their life. That's just a grief experience. And I'll tell them the same thing. I'll say, given what you've given up for your addiction, I'd be worried about you if you wasn't feeling some grief. But maybe we need to, and the problem is with grief, the only way out I was through it. So we need to help you mourn it and get through it. Okay, and the basic emotion here in this last one is self-reconciliation and hope. Because that's what I'm trying to do. Once I work through the grieving process, I get back to where I can be okay with who I am, and then I redefine myself, if I'm an addict, around my recovery instead of around my addiction. And I reconcile the self-blame between me and other people, and me is the biggest part of it. And so I can be okay in spite of what's happened to me and what I've done. And when I start to do that, Kubler-Ross causes acceptance. And I think acceptance is a prerequisite for that. And acceptance precedes change. I can't change something until I accept it the way it is. And when it comes to these kind of things, The hard part is a lot of times I have to accept it in spite of the way it is. And the byproduct of that is hope. I remember reading once, and I always like this analogy. In fact, at our clinic, I put it on a little fridge magnet that we used to give out. And it just said, a person can live a month or so without food. You might last a week or so without water, but you won't last 30 seconds without hope. And my friend who drove his truck under a semi and killed himself had lost that. He had slipped back and was doing methamphetamine. He was a carpenter, heck of a good, did amazing work, very talented, which is usually the case with addicts. They're usually some of our most talented people. But he couldn't do that because he was on disability because of back pain. And his wife had left him, so now he was totally isolated and felt totally worthless. And the only way he could see to get out was to destroy himself. I heard this once, and it's a good idea. Addiction is one of the most painful diseases you can have. It hurts more than anything you ever have, emotionally. And most addicts hate their addict piece because they can see what it's doing, but they can't do anything to stop it. And they hate all the pain. And that sometimes suicide is an act of homicide against that addict part of them. They don't know how to do it. They want to take them out, and that's the only way they can do it. And so, but hope helps them understand maybe there's another way to deal with this stuff. And hope comes from what we can do and do have, and having people to help us is what I've learned. But, you can get in a place. This friend of mine had called me. He did it on a Monday, and he'd called me like the Friday before and asked me if he could talk with me. I said, sure. And I'd set an appointment to meet with him, and I'm not doing clinical work now, but I'll still meet with people and talk to them, support them. And if they need a clinician, I'll direct them to one, but just help them look at what's going on. I don't call it clinical work, but it gets pretty close to that sometimes, okay? And so the day of the appointment, he called that morning and said, no, I can't make it. But I think he'd already decided then that he was going to take himself out. And in retrospect, I thought, well, maybe I should have gone and picked him up. But, hindsight's 20/20. But I wanted him to make that commitment. And, but you never know. And I saw another friend of his at a meeting last night, and he had called this guy and told him what he was going to do, and then turned around and did it. So I know he's hurting right now, so I'm going to keep in touch with him and help him understand that that's what it is, and it ain't what you do that's the issue as much as what you can't do sometimes. And the idea is to get to where you redefined and reconciled all that internal conflict and loss, and find some hope to build on. And there are some cultural myths that make it harder for us to do this. Like I say, our culture don't handle grief very well at all. It's very threatening to people. When you see somebody in grieving, it triggers a lot of that for all of us. We all have a lot of loss going on. And one of the first myths is, well, you should be over that by now. And like I say, some things you don't get over. I'll never get over the loss of my arm and leg and what I had to go through. And if something's significant enough, it don't go away. And people tell you, that happened, in my case, 30 years ago. You should be over that by now. Or that person hadn't been in your life for 5 years. You should be over that by now. What do you do? What's that? And the message you get there, it's not okay to be like that. And the next one we hear all the time is what I call the Mrs. Lincoln response. That's the kind of thing that says to Mary Lincoln when she's leaving the Ford Theater, well, other than that, how'd you like to play? And in our own culture, one of the most common responses when we see somebody grieving and in a lot of traumatic pain, what do we say to them? Are you okay? And the answer is not only no, but hell no, right? And we've all learned, and what I'm really saying is, you're not being okay makes me really uncomfortable, so I need for you to tell me that you're okay so I won't feel so uncomfortable. And we all know how to play that game, and what's the standard answer? I'm fine. And so now we don't have to deal with this stuff. Yeah, right. But that's part of the barriers. And maybe we need to start learning how to say, I ain't doing so good, and I'm getting there, but I'm still struggling some, And I've tried to learn not to do that. And now, first thing I'll say to people sometimes is, I know you're not doing so good, but is there anything you need, anything I can do to help you, and validate their right to feel the way they feel, and let them know that they got a resource that can support them. I asked a person, I said, he was an addict. I said, well, what's going on with your addiction? He said, I always have this feeling that something awful is going to happen. He said, I don't know what it is, but it just kind of hangs there all the time. And grief can be like that sometimes. I got this sense that something really awful has happened, but I'm not sure what it is or how to describe it. And sometimes the language isn't enough. We don't have words for these kind of things a lot of times, and so all you can do is do the best you can, be supportive and validating, and be honest and share yourself with them. That's the greatest gift you have to offer them. And the bridge thing we've talked about, what connects all of us is our vulnerability. And when it comes to something like this, it's essential. And that's where doing my own work around it makes me a resource, not only me, but to them. And then you can put that bridge out. And it allows them, and it gives them permission to do the same thing. And then that's a real significant relationship. And I don't think that's accidental. I think that's part of how God wired us to help us with this. Don't come for nothing, but once we can make it okay, it's an amazing resource, and it really is significant. So yeah. And I think, quite frankly, God's got His bridge out to us all the time, And that's important to know, because if I can't go anywhere else, I got that to go to. And that's helped me over and over. Okay, let's look at the initial shock after severe loss. Like I say, is avoidance. It triggers fear, trauma, and terror. I'm going to repeat some of this stuff. It results in a sense of vulnerability that causes the addict to react by denying or avoiding the new reality. We will deny, rationalize, distract through evasion or other addictions. Staying busy, that's a good one. And how do I resolve this? Here again, the avoidance is triggered by fear of powerlessness, loss of control, and limitation. And grief, I think, more than any other experiences, puts us in touch with our powerlessness and our limitations and our loss of control. And that ain't one of my favorite things, I'll tell you, is to feel powerless or vulnerable or limited. But we are. The two words that we can use to describe that is not God. We're not God, and we're not supposed to be. But because we're powerless don't necessarily mean that we're helpless. But this involves facing reality by gaining knowledge and resources to belong in the context of the new reality the way it is. Not the way I want it to be, but the way it is. Blame, which is the second thing here, is triggered by fear and resentment. After the initial shock, the next thing I feel is, pardon my French, I speak a little Marine, is pissed off. It's not fair. And that can take us into the why stage. And in the why stage, I struggle with the why. Why me, my spouse, or my son, or my family, or my friend, or whatever. And this kind of crazy energy drives the addict to try to figure out why it happened. This is still a form of denial because the addict believes if I can figure out why, I can fix it. Good example of that is next time you have a tooth that really hurts you, go in the dentist, sit down and say, Doc, this tooth is killing me. Tell me why it hurts. And see if that makes it stop hurting. Because why don't change anything. It just can make you crazy trying to figure it out. So we need to change the focus. We need to the acceptance keeps coming up. Acceptance of our powerlessness and limitations. And this is complicated by a powerless shame trigger, because a lot of us have learned as a result of different experiences in our life, particularly as kids, that when we're powerless, we feel helpless. And when we're helpless, we get hurt. And that makes us worthless. And that's a shame piece. And so whenever I have that connection, anytime I feel powerless, it's going to take me right into that shame. And that makes it harder to accept. And the way you heal shame is by getting it out in a safe place and exposing it. It goes away. So you have to get it out and own it. And you need to change the focus from why I have the problem to what I can do to deal with. And if you don't know, then you go learn what you can do to deal with it. A friend of mine's always said that when he has a situation and he doesn't know how to deal with it, his first thought is, I can't be the only person ever have to deal with this thing. So I need to find somebody that has been there and learn from them how they've dealt with it. And that can help me do the same thing. So that's a very practical way of going from the why to the what. And then here again, the let's make a deal, the frustration comes in. You see, the addict has tried unsuccessfully to avoid, get angry about what has happened. This leaves him very frustrated and seeking to cut a deal, manipulation. Problem is you cannot make deals with something that you don't have any power over. And in attempting to do so, next time we get 30 below or a big snowstorm and you got to go somewhere, go out and see if you can cut a deal with the weather to get the road melted off so you don't have to worry about traveling. And here again, if you really believe you can do that, the more you try and fail, the more frustrated you get. And it sets you up for a vicious cycle and sets you up for greater manipulation. And so we need to let go of that trying to control what we can't, what we're powerless over. And here again, resolution requires us to accept limitations and the inability to bargain with reality and letting go of control. You know, there's a paradox of control for the addict and the family. The more you try to control another person or something out here, the more it controls you. And that triggers a lot of frustration and anxiety and powerlessness too. And once you let go and start working here, then out here will be what it is and you can deal with it better. Here again, grief activates pain centers in the brain near the deep limbic system. Here are some of the problems we see with severe grief in our deep limbic system. There's moodiness, irritability, severe depression. There's a negative perception of life, decreased motivation. There's a flood of negative emotions, appetite, sleep problems, decreased or increased sexual responses, social isolation. What is this a checklist for? Clinical depression. That's why I think people get misdiagnosed so often with depression. The severe grief occurs when you're unable to avoid your reality and your situation, and it makes you really afraid, it mimics traumatic stress and is traumatic stress. And the thing with here again, a lot of times you'll cry a lot, you withdraw from people in life, addictions become solution. You may be at risk of clinical depression and suicide, and when you get to that point, you may need professional help or meds. But here's the problem. Let's go one more. And grief mimics depression, but if the pain is grief reaction, medications may be contraindicated in that grief pain needs to be experienced and expressed to heal. And what happens if you get medicated? Pain goes away. And I've seen, and if you're an addict, you don't need a prescription. All you got to do is go down to your local bar and self-medicate. And I've seen numerous times people come in, and when they get in recovery, they've got all this unfinished grief that they've been avoiding and medicating for years. But and they still got to deal with it. And it doesn't get better, yeah. It don't get better. Yeah, the hurt's still there, it just don't bother you now. And that's the good news and the bad news. I think we're better off feeling the pain than avoiding it. If we can use it. Here again, the addict needs to experience and express their pain to heal it. And if meds block this, it's left unhealed and unfinished. This is a component of severe grief, can be something I call the wasted time syndrome. If you've been in a relationship or you're an addict, you start looking at all the time and energy you put into this relationship and your life, and sometimes you can start just thinking, well, maybe my whole life and maybe this whole relationship's just been a big waste of time. And that sense of wasted time can really trigger the grief and loss and the hurt and the shame and the vulnerability and all the stuff that goes with it. And so I'm not going to tell you about this one. You ready for this, Perry? Okay, there's an Eagles song called Wasted Time that expresses it better than I can. He's going to pull it up. What I want you to do, though, is not just listen to it. I've got copies of the lyrics here. I want you to look at them, and I want you to think about some of the significant losses in your life where you've had that experience of wasted time, and see if this touches some of that, and trust what comes, and see if it triggers some of that stuff in your life. And then we're going to spend a little time talking about it, okay? There's a couple of lyrics in there I think are pretty powerful. I could have done so many things if I could only stop my mind from wondering what I left behind and from worrying about this wasted time. But the song ends with what you can do to deal with it. Remember what you told me before you went out on your own. One of God's paradoxes is sometimes to keep it together, you gotta leave it alone.